Vladimir Putin has often been described as Russia's accidental president. On the surface, this seems like an appropriate term. His rise to power did happen extraordinarily quickly. After his appointment as Russia's prime minister, many were shocked that a grey-suited nobody like Putin had suddenly found himself with so much power. But it seems that Putin's ascension wasn't really a matter of chance at all. In fact, former KGB agents had been closely observing his career ever since he joined the mayoral administration of Leningrad. They had been testing his loyalties and noting the sort of image he projected in public appearances. Both before and throughout his time in politics, Putin has hobnobbed with KGB agents, and his presidency has ensured that their power is cemented in Russian politics. From childhood, Vladimir Putin dreamed of joining the KGB, the Soviet Union's secret police force. He was eager to follow in his father's footsteps. So eager, in fact, that he called up the local Leningrad KGB office and asked to join before he'd even graduated school. Throughout his education, Putin was careful to enroll in exactly the programs and classes which the KGB office directed him toward. He followed their orders with the utmost precision. All the while, he vented his aggression by practicing judo. As a newly minted member of the KGB, Putin arrived in Dresden, East Germany, in 1985. It was there he first encountered secret missions, smuggling, and assassinations. Meanwhile, East Germany itself was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the ruling Communist Party was in danger of collapse. Sensing these issues, the KGB launched a secret mission called Operation Luch. Its goal was to build up a network of agents to join political circles. That way, the KGB's presence in Germany would survive, even if the country was reunified. Much of Putin's role in this operation remains a mystery. But what we do know is that Putin eventually became the main KGB liaison officer with the Stasi, the East German secret police. He even had his own Stasi identification card. That gave him access to Stasi buildings and made it easier for him to recruit agents for Operation Luch. Terrorism was also a major part of the mission. In particular, the secret police were deeply involved with the Red Army faction, a Marxist group in West Germany that helped to protect KGB interests. On one occasion, the chairman of the major financial institution, Deutsche Bank, was driving to work when a grenade in his car was detonated, killing him instantly. It's possible that the blast was triggered by a Red Army faction member, and we know that this group learned precise military detonation techniques at training camps connected to the Stasi. With the chairman's death, Deutsche Bank was weakened, and a Stasi-affiliated bank had an opportunity to gain strength. These secret operations with the KGB and the Stasi were just the start of Putin's long rise to power. At the time of the Soviet Union, the ruling Communist Party and the KGB were like peas in a pod. The laundry list of financial crimes they committed together is practically endless. One of their joint schemes involved the KGB physically smuggling millions of dollars to left-leaning groups abroad. Legally, these funds had to be pulled from donations to the Communist Party. So the government sent its own money to Communist Party members. Then they transferred it abroad via the KGB. Through the Communist Party, the KGB was essentially in control of the entire country's finances and economy. However, everything changed in the age of liberal reforms under Boris Yeltsin. In October 1991, President Yeltsin signed an order abolishing the KGB. He broke it up into 4 separate domestic departments. Despite this change, former KGB operatives continued to serve as advisors, held government positions, and controlled the oil sector throughout the first half of the 1990s. But soon, the agents' power began to erode. This was largely thanks to Yeltsin's sweeping democratic reforms. These included the privatization of several industries. Suddenly, a group of young business tycoons, later known as oligarchs, started gaining power. Despite his attempts at reform, Yeltsin's state coffers were running dry. In response, a banker named Vladimir Putin proposed an ingenious scheme. It became known as loans for shares privatization. In exchange for helping out the Russian government with loans, he and his fellow tycoons would receive stakes in some of the nation's biggest enterprises in oil and other resources. The loans for shares privatizations allowed the tycoons to gain enormous power and influence, far eclipsing that of former KGB officials. The new oligarchs now held massive power over Russia's various industries. But nearby, in St. Petersburg, KGB agents still exerted their control. Early in 1990, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, Vladimir Putin was ordered to return to Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was then known. There, he set his sights on Leningrad's burgeoning pro-democracy movement. The movement seemed dangerously likely to disrupt the Communist Party's dominance over the city's politics. Soon, Putin became the liaison between the KGB and a man named Anatoly Sobchak. Sobchak was a charismatic law professor who frequently spoke in favor of democracy and against the KGB in public. But in private, he may have had unofficial dealings with the organization. By May of that year, Sobchak was appointed the new city council chairman, with Putin as his right-hand man. Soon, Sobchak became mayor, and the city was in bad shape. Its coffers were empty, shop shelves contained little more than pickled cucumbers, and policing was lax, which meant organized crime groups had free rein to extort local businesses. It was nothing less than chaos. But what emerged from that chaos was an alliance between Putin and the KGB that allowed the organization to run the city's economy for itself. The KGB's enrichment began with the creation of a slush fund, or obshuk. This fund could be used to funnel cash to the KGB for its personal use and for strategic operations. To create this obshuk, Putin's committee gave $95 million worth of export licenses to a series of front companies. Ostensibly, the companies would bring in food imports. The starving city desperately needed the food, but almost none of it ever arrived. The money had gone into the obshuk instead. Along with the obshuk, the KGB also took control of the Leningrad seaport, run by Viktor Karchenko. One day in 1993, Karchenko was stopped by the police. They hauled him off the train he was traveling on and charged him with embezzlement. Though he was eventually released, Putin's KGB men nonetheless installed their own man in his place. Finally, KGB officers took control of Leningrad's seaport and oil terminal through Ilya Traber, a man linked to the Tambov organized crime group. Putin and his deputy issued licenses that allowed Traber to control the port and the oil terminal, along with one of Putin's KGB colleagues, Gennady Timchenko. All of these men went on to take senior executive positions in the country's strategic assets, after Putin assumed the presidency. St. Petersburg's mayor, Anatoly Sobchak, lost his campaign for re-election in the summer of 1996. Vladimir Putin, who was loyal to Sobchak, immediately resigned from the city's administration. Less than a month after his resignation, Putin was invited to Moscow. He was asked to take the position of deputy head of the Kremlin administration. He was ultimately blocked from that role. But in its place, he became head of the Kremlin's foreign property department. The position represented the core of Russia's imperial wealth. This was a major promotion for Putin. However, it was far from the end of Putin's dramatic rise in the ranks. After his promotion to head of the Kremlin's foreign property department, Putin received several other promotions in quick succession. 3 months later, he was appointed head of the FSB, the security services agency that succeeded the KGB. Then, on Monday, August 9th, 1999, a shock announcement came. Putin was to become the nation's new prime minister. How was Putin able to rise in the ranks so quickly? Well, looking back, it seems that he was being propelled by former KGB generals. They needed an individual who was willing to cooperate with them, follow orders, and appear strong on television. Putin was exactly that individual. But at this point, he was still a nobody in the public's eye. That all changed in September 1999, when a series of 3 deadly bombings tore through apartment complexes across Russia. It caused a nationwide panic. In the midst of the crisis, Vladimir Putin stepped up to the plate. He became, essentially, the country's commander-in-chief. The bombings had been blamed on Chechen fighters. So Putin led a campaign of airstrikes across Chechnya. He publicly addressed the Russian people, vowing to fight back and avenge the innocent Russians who had died. Questions still swirl around these events. Some even believe the bombings were secretly coordinated by the FSB.
Putin came forward as the savior of the country. He was put in charge of a war in Chechnya. The bombings were blamed on Chechens without any evidence whatsoever. And as a result of the successful prosecution of that war, against all odds, he was elected the next Russian president.
At the very beginning of Putin's reign, few people predicted that the country was heading toward authoritarianism and kleptocracy. But a few people did see the writing on the wall. One of these prescient few was an oligarch named Boris Berezovsky. Among other businesses, he owned a television channel called ORT. The channel devoted much of its airtime to criticizing Putin. Furious with how ORT had portrayed him, Putin ordered an investigation of Berezovsky over embezzlement claims. Eventually, these accusations forced Berezovsky to flee Russia.
And he survived several attempts on his life. But when in the late 90s Putin wanted to end the political hopes of Russia's oligarchs, its richest men, Berezovsky left for Britain and became one of Putin's fiercest critics. In his absence, a Russian court had convicted him of stealing millions of dollars, but Berezovsky, who always denied the charges, refused to be silenced. Vladimir Putin's press secretary told Russian television that Berezovsky had recently written to the president apologizing for his mistakes, but this has not been verified by the Berezovsky family. Boris Berezovsky was found dead in his home near London. He was 67.
Putin's takedown of ORT signaled the beginning of his seizure of Russia's free media and the oligarchs that controlled it. Next, he had his sights on taking out the oil tycoons. After the Soviet Union's collapse, the Russian state lost its monopoly over the oil industry, which promptly splintered into 4 separate companies: Lukoil, Yukos, Surgutneftgaz, and Rosneft. Thanks to Yeltsin's privatizations and the loans for shares scheme, the oil industry was firmly in the hands of the oligarchs. When Putin took over from Yeltsin, oil prices had begun to surge, so the oligarchs' massive fortunes increased. It became Putin's mission to wrest back control over the oil sector. Rosneft was already under state control, and the director of Surgutneftgaz was closely connected to the KGB. That left 2 companies to wrangle: Lukoil and Yukos. Just like Putin's media crackdown, his takeover of Lukoil began with a bogus investigation. In 2000, one of Lukoil's directors, Vargit Alekperov, was accused of tax fraud. Then, 2 years later, Lukoil's first vice president was drugged and kidnapped by masked men wearing police uniforms. A week later, the government announced that Lukoil had agreed to pay the government $103 million in back taxes. Lukoil and the Kremlin seemed to have reached an agreement. Some of Alekperov's stake in Lukoil would secretly belong to Putin, although Lukoil denies this was the case. The last oil major left to take over was Yukos, but the oil company's owner, who happened to be Russia's richest man at the time, wouldn't hand over his business willingly. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian oligarch who was once the chairman and CEO of the oil company Yukos, is a self-described adrenaline-sheik, an adrenaline junkie. So, when Vladimir Putin sought to take control of Yukos, Khodorkovsky refused to bend to the president's will. He hired Western executives and drilling equipment manufacturers to entrench the company in Western markets. He created Open Russia, a philanthropic organization that taught Russian teenagers the principles of democracy. He even gave a presentation accusing the Russian government of corruption at a meeting where Vladimir Putin himself was present. But despite Khodorkovsky's bold moves, Putin's crackdown proved too much for him to handle. Throughout the early 2000s, Khodorkovsky was pouring millions of dollars into funding Putin's political opponents, including those in the Communist Party. At a private dinner one evening, Putin ordered Khodorkovsky to stop funding the communists. As expected, Khodorkovsky resisted. In response, Putin quickly began taking major actions against the oligarch and Yukos. First, the police arrested Yukos' security chief, Alexei Pichugin, and charged him with murder. Then they arrested Khodorkovsky's right-hand man, Platon Lebedev. The investigations caused Yukos' stock to plummet. Then, a few months later, FSB commandos bearing machine guns began raiding Yukos-related locations across Moscow. Finally, Khodorkovsky himself was arrested. For 8 months before his trial, Khodorkovsky was detained in a Moscow prison. He claimed this was an illegal abuse of power that set a dangerous precedent, and the court proceedings themselves were dictated by the Kremlin. The trial was rushed, and laws were applied retroactively and selectively. Khodorkovsky was ultimately given an 8-year jail sentence for tax fraud. The proceedings ended with the Kremlin breaking up Yukos and seizing many of its assets for itself. Prior to Yukos's breakup, 80% of Russia's oil output had been in private hands. By the end, it was just 45%. At Moscow's Dubrovka Musical Theatre, 900 audience members packed the seats as tap dancers leaped across the stage. As the second act of the musical opened, the unthinkable happened. 40 armed Chechen fighters stormed into the theatre, firing warning shots from assault rifles into the air. They began to wire the building with explosives and sealed off the auditorium. Women wearing black hijabs and explosive belts positioned themselves amongst the rows. The Chechen fighters occupying the theatre were demanding an end to Russia's war in the Chechen Republic. They gave the government 7 days to withdraw its troops. Otherwise, they would blow up the theatre. But was the situation really as straightforward as it seemed? 3 days into the siege, Russian security services released a gas consisting of the opioid fentanyl into the auditorium. The gas was indiscriminately deadly. It knocked out the Chechens, but it also killed 113 hostages. And rather than bringing them in for questioning, the FSB shot the Chechens dead. The reason for the situation's mishandling is still shrouded in mystery, but one Kremlin insider claims that the attack had actually been planned by the FSB chief at the time, Nikolai Patrushev, in order to increase national support for the Chechen war and paint Putin as a hero. Whether this is true or not, the situation did cause global and local leaders to praise Putin. His ratings in Russia surged, the FSB was rewarded with an increase in funding, and the military was allowed to escalate its activity in Chechnya. The apparent terrorist attack provided a useful myth to help Putin's regime forge a national identity. Thanks to rising oil prices, Russia's fortunes were growing throughout the early 2000s. Even in remote Siberia, restaurants were serving lamb from New Zealand and wine from France. These days of plenty also allowed Russian companies to slowly begin listing their shares on Western stock exchanges, especially in London. London Stock Exchange was particularly enticing for the Russians. Compared to the requirements for companies to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange, London's requirements were lax. Still, many in the West believed that by forcing the Russians to adhere to a Western standard of transparency, they would discourage shady financial dealings on the Russians' part. But in fact, the Russians' presence in London did exactly the opposite. It ended up infecting the West like a virus. The infection began in many ways with Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. He had risen to prominence during the Yeltsin era, yet proved himself loyal to Putin. So when Putin asked Abramovich to head to London and purchase Chelsea Football Club, Abramovich did as he was told. Putin had accurately guessed that getting British people to accept Russian presence could be done via their national sport. By this time, the Russian government had a controlling 51% stake in several major Russian companies. That meant that Westerners were free to divvy up the other 49% of the stakes in each of these companies. Londoners were blinded by the cash flow that had become available. They ignored the fact that Russia had all but shunned its democracy. Even now, Russian cash flows through London via offshore front companies. Through London, Russia had flexed its financial might in the West. Next, it was time to make political moves. After Putin's second term ended in 2008, Dmitry Medvedev assumed the Russian presidency. Many in the West hoped he would move his country's economy back to a freer market system. His willingness to cooperate with Western leaders seemed like a sign that liberalism was back on the rise in Russia. In August 2008, Russia escalated military action in the Western-leaning former Soviet Republic of Georgia. This ended any hope the country had of joining NATO, and Medvedev extended the term of his successor to 6 years instead of 4. This was a clear signal that Putin was waiting in the wings to return as Russia's president. And this time, Putin was ready to extend his political reach even further. Once Putin regained the presidency in 2012, his and his cronies' financial schemes continued in full force. But all wasn't well for Russia economically. Oil price growth was slowing, and business people were afraid to invest in a system that could raid, threaten, or jail them at any moment. Rather than attempt any reforms, though, Putin chose to continue his project of imperial expansion. In February 2014, Russia threatened to go to war with Ukraine over a Russian military base in Crimea if Ukraine didn't reverse its pro-Western trajectory. On the morning of February 27th, masked troops bearing no military insignia stormed the Crimean parliament. They hoisted a Russian flag over the building. A referendum was quickly called for a vote on Crimea joining Russia. Crimeans voted overwhelmingly in favor. In response, Europe and the US implemented sanctions targeting Putin's inner circle, but the conflict in Ukraine continued to escalate and spread to eastern Ukraine. Russian fighters, or volunteers as Russia cagily called them, were joined by local pro-Russia militants using Russian military hardware. Only after the Crimean annexation was complete did Putin finally admit that some of these so-called volunteers had been Russian troops. The resulting death toll from the fighting stands at 13,000 today. A quarter of those killed have been civilians. The annexation of Crimea and subsequent war in eastern Ukraine was nothing less than a proxy war against the West. What happened there was a warning sign of the turbulence the Russians were soon to create elsewhere. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Putin and his men were funneling black cash into the West through a series of complex money laundering schemes. Some of these schemes involved offshore companies that received payments funneled in from tycoons close to Putin. Others involved shell companies signing fake loan agreements between themselves. Agreements that were then used to siphon money out of Russia. Then there were mirror trades. These allowed investors to buy Russian stocks in Russian rubles, while seemingly unconnected companies sold the same amount of stock through Deutsche Bank in London. With tricks like these, Russia funneled money into the West. To this end, Russian cash, both official and unofficial, was used to create a web of agencies. The agencies promoted the Kremlin's version of world events, along with popularizing Russian language and culture. The same cash was used to fund Russian Cossack paramilitary youth camps, a paramilitary biker group called the Night Wolves, as well as the foundation of Saint Vasily the Great, whose goal was supposedly to spread Orthodox values. But in reality, it funded pro-Kremlin separatists in Ukraine. Along with spreading this particular flavor of Slavic culture, Putin's men were using slush funds to support European anti-establishment parties on the extreme left and right, particularly in the Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Austria. By cultivating extremism in these countries, Russia aimed to weaken the EU and potentially break its consensus on sanctions against Russia. And in the UK, Kremlin cash poured into Tory coffers. Russia's security chief, Nikolai Patrushev, even developed a close relationship with Boris Johnson. During the time of the Soviet Union, the KGB was a major controlling force within the Russian economy. Its power slipped in the 1990s when a group of young oligarchs rose to power, but Vladimir Putin's presidency allowed former KGB agents to regain their grip on Russian business and politics. Throughout his presidency, Putin has slowly eroded Russia's democracy by seizing control of the media and other industries, all while attempting to further his nation's imperial mission and sow discord in the West.